I'm Dr. Rodriguez from the School of Education. We appreciate everybody's patience and everybody's sense of family as we all squeeze in here tonight. Our keynote speaker has arrived. He's somewhere around the building. I've confirmed that, so he will be walking in shortly. Again, I do appreciate everybody's patience and willingness to all sit like close family that we are, and we'll get started here shortly. Thank you, everybody. All right, good evening, everybody. We can do better than that. How about an HU? Let's give a better welcoming to our guest here, especially from our wonderful guests from the National Association of Black School Educators. Let's show them how it's done. HU? All right, we'll warm up to it. Well, welcome. As I said earlier, my name is Dr. Cristobal Rodriguez. I'm an associate professor in the School of Education. I'm also the director of graduate studies. More importantly, it is my honor and blessing to serve as the chair of the Charles Thompson Lecture Colloquium Committee. A few things before we get started here tonight. I want to also make sure I recognize the committee. If members of the Charles Thompson Committee could stand up or raise your hand, we want to recognize you and thank you for your wonderful effort. Committee members, colleagues. Hopefully, it's my first year as the chair, so I'm expecting the former chairs in the room to take some notes and give me some feedback at the end of the day. I'm always looking forward to feedback, so thank you all. I also want to be able to recognize, we've recognized our NAPSI folks. I want to recognize a few other individuals in the room, particularly the folks who are always running around behind the scenes, which is especially our staff. We have not just the School of Education staff to thank for, Ms. Berry, Dr. Searles, and Dr. Searles' partner, who is always pulling through like good family and helping us out with the events. And we also have Ms. Jackson in the house, any of the School of Social Work staff as well in the building. Raise your hand, please stand up. Staff, HOSOE staff, who are you? I know I saw you earlier. I see Dr. Searles, Ms. Berry, Ms. Jackson. There's someone, let's give them a hand. So, at this point, I'm going to ask our wonderful dean. It's her first year as the official dean of the Howard University School of Education. Dean Don Williams, it's a privilege and honor to introduce you to our event.
Well, good evening, everyone. And what a wonderful sight it is to see from up here, of seeing all of you gathered together for this scholarly tradition that we call the Charles Thompson Lecture. And Dr. Rodriguez, thank you for your leadership as his first year, and I would say that you did a great job your first year. You have packed the house. For those of you who don't have a seat, my apologies for that. Many of you may know that Blackburn is offline this semester, so it has impacted on what facility we would have for an event, and we have a great big public scholar named of Dr. Mark Lamont Hill, and this will be the time that Blackburn was offline. But we're going to do our best here. We know that we're going to hear great words from Dr. Hill. So it is my pleasure to formally extend greetings and welcome you to the 39th Annual Charles Thompson Lecture Colloquium Series. This esteemed lecture was established in 1980 as a living memorial to Professor Thompson. He was also the founding editor for the Journal of Negro Education. The articulated purpose of the lecture is to contribute to the continued study and solution of the unresolved problems that still impede the education of blacks and ethnic minorities in the United States and in developing countries. The Charles Thompson Lecture Committee has already been recognized, but I'd like for you to raise your hands again. I've had the opportunity to serve on that committee for at least 11 or 12 years. Please raise your hands again to be recognized. Thank you so much. Let's give them a hand, please. Please know that they start their work at least a year in advance to bring you a fantastic program, and as a matter of fact, they meet tomorrow afternoon to debrief on the event for today to begin planning for next year. And next year, as I was speaking to Dr. Thompson, is our 40th year, so I'm really expecting great things for our 40th tradition of this lecture. But the Charles Thompson Lecture is one that we know that empowers us with the knowledge to address the issues in the ways that we know best. through teaching, leadership, psychological and counseling services, policy advocacy, and of course, community mobilization. The lecture also reminds us to push past and through disparaging discourse that attempts to cloud our vision and redirect our efforts. The lecture and the Journal of Negro Education, hopefully all of you are subscribed, and if you're a student, you already have a subscription through our library service. But you should know that they go hand in hand. The Journal continues to be our resounding vehicle to make sure that we have a scholarly forum in which research on issues relevant to Black education have a voice. I would also like to recognize those committee members that are printed in your program for, again, this amazing dedicated work that they do. But the faculty of the School of Education, will you all please either stand or raise your hands, please, to be recognized? I commend you for pausing your classroom instruction to make sure that our students are present in the scholarly tradition. The Journal of Negro Education staff, past and present, many of them are in the room. You saw some of them as you were checking in today. Thank them for helping to sustain and grow our audience. And then also our visitors today, and I'm going to actually ask them to stand, from the National Alliance of Black School Educators. Can you all please stand and be recognized? ABSE, as they are affectionately known, is convening in Baltimore right now for their annual conference. And because they were in Baltimore, they thought it important enough to come to Howard University to visit. So we've been hosting them for half of the day, and we wanted to make sure that their day ended with this lecture. Well, so many of you, including myself, may be feeling a bit fatigued this evening, as you all may have stayed up very late last night watching the outcome of what is being touted as a historic voter turnout for our midterm elections. It's being said that 113 million people voted. And I'm sure everyone in this room is a part of that 113 million. So as this annual lecture is always held the first Wednesday of November, this is not the first time that we have come into this space and we either felt feelings of despair or feelings of hope the day after Election Day. So you all can tell me what you feel. We know that voting may not change everything, but we also know that not voting can have serious consequences. You should know the inaugural lecture, which was in 1980, was delivered by Dr. Stephen J. Wright. Dr. Wright was an alumnus of Howard University School of Education and served as the 7th president of Fisk University. He also led the United Negro College Fund. Hence, his lecture was entitled, "The Tragic Waste of Black Mind and Talent." In 38 years, there have been a number of lectures that focus on the issues of Black education situated in a larger political context, like we'll hear tonight. In 2002, Dr. Mulima Shuja lectured on the widening gap between education and schooling in the post-9/11 era. In 2006, Dr. A. Wade Boykin, one of our own, who's also present in this room, lectured on providing a world-class education for our children and youth, shifting the schooling paradigm. In 2010, Dr. Linda Darling Hammond lectured on the flat world and education, how America's commitment to equity will determine our future. And in 2015, Dr. Tyrone Howard lectured on why Black Lives Matter, race, gender, and freedom schools in the quest for educational equity. So as depicted in Dr. Charles Thompson's biography, Dr. Thompson sought to close the gap between America's democratic precepts and its undemocratic practices by molding public opinion favorable to a significant expansion of civil rights among scholars, policymakers, and the public. Recognizing that the time is always now, we are committed to making an impact to refine the ways that our research informs our activism and document how our activism is influencing our research. During our 39th lecture, we look forward to hearing from Dr. Mark Lamont Hill on the decriminalizing of the imagination, schooling towards a world without prison. Again, welcome and enjoy the program.
I said this is the first year as official dean, but it's actually third year as the dean, as she was interim, but it's nice to have the official position of Dean Williams. Next up, we have our wonderful, amazing advocate and scholar, Dr. Ivory Thompson from the Journal of Negro Education, Editor-in-Chief.
right, good evening. All right, y'all ready to get this party started? All right. Okay, well, I want to bring brief greetings on behalf of the Journal of Negro Education. This is the 29th annual Charles Thompson Lecture, and it is powered by the Journal of Negro Education. It's the Journal of Negro Education is the engine behind this event, and of course, the committee who you've been introduced to are the ones that give it the juice, that do all the work and planning and conceptualizing it. We have several members of the staff who are here. Many of them are not in this room, but they're out there working. But I owe so much gratitude to Ms. Hill and Ms. Joseph. I've been the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Negro Education for 10 years this year, and they have been with me the entire 10-year period. So I want you all to give them a round of applause. I also want to recognize our dean for the leadership that she gives the School of Education. As many of you all know, yesterday was a historic election in the fact that we have a lot of women representing us in Congress. From my perspective, I've seen that leadership change happen in the School of Education. When I first got to the School of Education back in 2005, we had a male dean, a male chair, and there was only one woman in my faculty cohort, or in my faculty program. As of in the spring, we will have a woman dean. My chair will be a woman. My program director is going to be a woman, or is a woman, and I will be the only male in my program. I also want to recognize our past committee members of the Charles Thompson Lecture. One in particular who came up from Atlanta, who served as a mentor to me since I came to Howard University, Dr. Aaron Stills. Please stand up. Dr. Stills has been at every single Charles Thompson Lecture in its entire 39-year history. And finally, I want you all to know that our special issue for the Journal of Negro Education was just released yesterday. It just came out yesterday, hot off the press. We do have some here today. This special issue is dedicated to the life of W.B. Du Bois. This year marks the 150th anniversary of Du Bois' birth. The cover of the journal, and I actually left it over there, I was going to have it as an illustration. Thank you. But the cover of this journal is actually from the archives of Howard University, and it features W.B. Du Bois receiving an honorary doctorate on his 96th birthday from the University of Accra in Ghana. W.B. Du Bois has really captured the essence in his research of what we try to do here at Howard University and with the Journal of Negro Education. The first issue of the Journal of Negro Education in 1932 actually featured an article from W.B. Du Bois, and that article is reprinted in this issue right here. In this issue, we tried to capture the influence that he had over research. Some of you all may know, many of you all probably don't, but when we think about things like geocoding, GIS analysis, big data analytics, it's really W.B. Du Bois' work from the Philadelphia Negro back in 1896 that gave way to that type of research. He was the first researcher to use community participatory research. He moved his family into the community that he was studying. He was the first researcher to use geocode analysis. He went to different people's houses, he interviewed them, and he marked it on the map. So a lot of the innovative research techniques that we have right now is because of W.B. Du Bois. W.B. Du Bois also was one of the first public research scholars. One of the first scholars to say that objectivity when it comes to studying black people is not enough and insufficient. It was W.B. Du Bois that said, one cannot be calm, cool, and detached scientists while Negroes are being lynched, murdered, and starved. Today we're going to hear from someone who encapsulates that, someone who understands that scholarship shouldn't be reserved for the ivory tower, as scholarship really needs to have a purpose and it needs to be delivered to the masses. Mark Lamont Hill will help to energize the faculty, staff, students, and visitors at Howard University as we embark upon this quest to take research to another level, to be authentically Black about the research that we deliver and make sure that our research has the purpose of uplifting our people and not merely objectifying them through objective research. So the next person I'm going to call up is Mr. Kofi Lanaus, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Hotep family, it's good to see you all. I'm going to read the bio for Dr. Mark Lamont Hill. Dr. Mark Lamont Hill is one of the leading intellectual voices in the country. He is currently the host of BET News and a political contributor for CNN. An award-winning journalist, Dr. Hill has received numerous prestigious awards from the National Association of Black Journalists, GLAAD, and the International Academy of Digital Arts and Sciences. Dr. Hill is the Steve Charles Professor of Media, Cities, and Solutions at Temple University. Prior to that, he held positions at Columbia University and Morehouse College. Since his days as a youth in Philadelphia, Dr. Hill has been a social justice activist and organizer. He is a founding board member of My Fifth, a non-for-profit organization devoted to educating youth about their legal rights and responsibilities. He is also a board member and organizer of the Philadelphia Student Union. Dr. Hill also worked closely with the ACLU Drug Reform Project, focusing on drug enforcement policies. Over the past few years, he has actively worked on campaigns to end the death penalty and to release numerous political prisoners. Ebony Magazine named him one of America's 100 most influential Black leaders. Dr. Hill is the author or co-author of 4 books: the award-winning Beats, Rhymes, and Classroom Life, Hip-Hop Pedagogy and Politics of Identity, The Classroom in the Cell, Conversations on Black Life in America, the New York Times bestseller, Nobody, Casualties of America's War on the Vulnerable from Ferguson to Flint and Beyond, and Gentrifier. He has also published 2 edited books, Media, Learning, and Sites of Possibilities in Schooling Hip-Hop, New Directions in Hip-Hop-Based Education. Trained as an anthropologist of education, Dr. Hill holds a PhD with distinction from the University of Pennsylvania. His research focuses on the intersections between culture, politics, and education in the United States and the Middle East. I did some searching to see what social media would say about Dr. Hill, and it was very interesting. But one thing that I learned in just my search of, well, what is the math saying about Dr. I came across a quote that I found very powerful. It says, Dr. Hill said, "We live in a world where Black humanity is a relatively new idea." And I think that that's just very powerful, because as we search and realize who we are and we Sankofa our past, we need scholars like you to make sure that we're aware of our greatness and pushing that conversation in the masses. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Lamont Hill.
Good evening, everybody. Forgive me my voice, I'm fighting a pretty bad cold, so if I'm a little out of breath and tired, that's why. But I wanted to make sure that I still came, because this place means so much to me. And this place means so much to us. Howard University. There are a few places that are as important and as rich in its intellectual legacy and tradition as Howard University. There are a few places that have allowed us to think richly and deeply and imagine the world and its possibilities in remarkably different ways. Howard has been home to some of the towering intellectuals of the 20th century, and to be sure, of the 21st century. When we rummage through history and we think about the great intellectual debates and we think about the intellectual developments, we think about texts like Black Bourgeoisie, the legendary E. Franklin Frazier. We hear names like Charles Drew. When we get to the 70s and 80s, we're here talking about Black education. You can't truly understand Black education without understanding an entire tradition, an entire cadre of Black psychologists, of African-centered psychologists, who help us to reimagine the way that African subjects in the world can be understood on strange territory. How our bodies and our spirits and our minds operate within an African-centered context, even if we are dislocated from home, even if we are strangers in a strange land. So when I hear Dr. Boykin is here, where is that? I can't see that good. Oh my God, brother, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I mean that sincerely, thank you. Our work stands on your shoulders, we stand on your shoulders, and we are proud to sit at your feet as we continue to learn from you. I remember being in graduate school at University of Pennsylvania, and there was only about 5 Black folk. It felt like, might have been 6. And Dr. Howard Stevenson had us sit down, and we were taking a course on racism and understanding race and racism, and I didn't have a language or a vocabulary to understand how our children enter classrooms in a certain way, and how our bodies and our spirits and our identities, our verb, our emotionality, are the ways that we might be polyphonic and polyvocal, and how we engage the social world is entirely illegible. What it means to operate from a social time perspective, I didn't understand that until I had a whole tradition of Black psychologists who taught me what this stuff meant. They were at Howard University. I remember being in February 27th, 2004. I was sitting in a crib in Philly. It wasn't my crib, it was somebody else's crib. And I was having a debate over all kinds of stuff. I don't even remember what it was, smart people stuff. And I was debating with the brother. I mentioned a book, he mentioned 17 books. I mentioned 17 books, he mentioned 37 books, and all their footnotes. That brother turned out to be Dr. Greg Carr. Towering intellectual, brilliant scholar, committed to educating a rich and deep and long legacy of African freedom fighters who would help us understand the world differently through scholarship. We got a whole lot of public intellectuals, but a whole lot of public and not that intellectual. What does it mean to be deeply engaged in ideas, deeply engaged in these traditions? We got to think about this stuff. My dear brother Ivory Tolson, oh my God. It takes more than a notion to run the Journal on Negro Education for 10 years. In a world where Black folk think the best journals to publish are the ones where ain't a whole lot of Black folk in them. Where if it's Black, it has to be inferior, where white folk ice is still colder. He's managed to take a tradition that begins in the 30s and move it into 2018, going into 2019, with the highest and most rigorous scholarship available. Your leadership is important. He's also a Temple University alum. He's an ideal leader, an ideal brother, except for being an alpha. He's damn near perfect. But I'm sorry, but nobody's perfect. Y'all did what y'all could. But all of this doesn't happen without leadership. Ivory said it best, but I'm gonna say it again because it bears repeating. Howard is better for having women at the helm. All institutions at this junction in history are better when we expand our leadership model so that it's not just one cisgender, Negro, heterosexual Christian male with a microphone running everything. The world is better for woman-led institutions. Howard is better. The College of Education is better for having you, Dean. So Dean Williams, I'm thankful, I'm grateful for you and for you all inviting me to Howard to come speak. I don't get invited to fancy places like this too often, man. So I don't take it for granted. I ain't gonna hold y'all super long. I'm gonna talk and then we're gonna have some dialogue. But I wanted to talk about this idea of decriminalizing the imagination. Why do I want us to think about decriminalizing the imagination? Because we live in the age of incarceration. What does it mean to live in the age of incarceration? The age of incarceration in the United States is partly about the reality that over the last 50 years we have gone from having 250,000 to now 2.3 million people in cages. 1 in 100 American citizens who are adults are incarcerated. Another 46 million are on the doorstep of prison, on parole and probation. When we add juvenile facilities, the numbers go through the roof. The United States makes up 5% of the global population and 24% of the nation's prison population. We are an incarceration nation. We love to label and demonize and stigmatize and marginalize other nations. Oh, that's the axis of evil. Look at Iraq, look at Iran, look at Afghanistan. We look at these, but look at Cuba. We got more than all of them combined incarcerated. You got a whole nation of folk incarcerated here, far more than the so-called global south, far more than the so-called communist and socialist countries. We are committed to incarceration as our primary function, as our primary response to social contradictions. And this is what it means to live in the incarceration nation. The age of incarceration is important to highlight because it is just that, an age of incarceration. Notice I didn't say mass incarceration. Because the language of mass incarceration is misleading and dishonest because it would imply that somehow there is a representative sampling of all Americans incarcerated across demographic differences. In other words, everybody ain't getting locked up the same. We are not mass incarcerating people because we don't have the same number of rich folk and the same number of upper middle class folk and the same number of white folk. We know we have mass incarceration of the vulnerable. The crisis is racially centered and racially targeted. But the age of incarceration isn't just about the fact that so many of us are in cages. That's part of the problem, to be sure, but the age of incarceration is also about a profound crisis of imagination. The prison looms so large that we can't imagine or see ourselves outside of it. All of our solutions are rooted not just in the prison, but in the logic of the prison. We equate justice with punishment and punishment with confinement. Our very identities as a nation is too often linked to the very notion of the prison. It is easier to imagine the end of the world itself than to imagine a world without prisons. That's what it means to live in the age of incarceration. And yeah, we might have began with good intention. The very idea of the penitentiary is rooted etymologically in the word for penitence. The idea was that we could give people a kind of almost monastic experience. You isolate some folk and you give them time to reflect, time to think, time to read, time to consider what they did wrong, and maybe they can return to society as better individuals. That sounds great. And this idea of penitence was, in fact, embedded in the early understanding and construction of the prison. That's what the Quakers had in mind. And Negroes started going to prison. Suddenly prison was stripped of its rehabilitative power and capacity and function. Suddenly the idea that prison could be a place where we reform is no longer in practice as a practical matter. In other words, the things that would make you less likely to go back to prison, like having access to your family, having access to education, having access to phone calls, having access to your children, having access to a GED, having access to a master's degree, having access to this kind of stuff. This kind of stuff is the very stuff that stops people from returning to prison. We have essentially stripped prison of all of its rehabilitative capacity and only held on to the idea that they are correctional facilities, when in fact the only thing they are correcting are the contradictions of white supremacist patriarchal empire. The prison has become a site of disposability for all the contradictions of America's failed democratic experiment. People are broke, they get incarcerated. People are in mental institutions and they become incarcerated. People are drug addicted, they become incarcerated. All the contradictions of empire become honed into one place. As Louis Bacan talks about, we have shifted from a medicalized model and a socialized model to a penalized model where all of our responses to social contradictions go to the prison. So you are in a medical facility in the 70s because you were struggling with mental health issues, and suddenly by 1980, really under Jimmy Carter at the beginning, but then ultimately under Ronald Reagan, we saw funding strip away from community-based mental health organizations. So people who were in mental homes were now on the street. And then we made it illegal to be on the street. We imposed a set of social policies against vagrancy and public trespassing, public urination, public everything that made it illegal to be on the street. So people who were in mental homes are now on the street, and it's illegal to be on the street, so they become trans-carcerated. They are moving from the captive state of the mental health mental health facility where they are being invested in into the prison. People who were getting drugs and drug treatment are now on the ground, and now they're self-medicating. At a moment where cheap synthetic drugs make it to the street at record number, that thing called crack. And then at the same time that crack is on the street, we begin to prosecute a more intensified war on drugs, where we are going to get tough on people who are using drugs, which is a medical addiction. We have criminalized a medical problem. To live in the age of incarceration is to criminalize all of our social problem. So, what they got to do with school? It's a fair question. It's a fair question. Oh my God, is that Nora Etiquette? Oh my God. So, one of the leading towering intellectuals who talks about the question of Black Palestinian transnational solidarity is Nora Etiquette. You see her on the interwebs debating folk, chopping folk down, doing brilliant transnational work, doing brilliant analysis. She's right there, Nora Etiquette. Give her a round of applause, just a brilliant scholar. And she continues to educate and teach me about how to think about the ways in which juridical forms of citizenship are not enough, that the law ain't enough. Citizenship isn't just about the juridical, it's not just about the legal, it's not just about the idea that I am a citizen or I am not a citizen. As we anthropologists talk about, citizenship is also about everyday ways of belonging. And part of what it means to live in the age of incarceration is to live in a moment where even when you get out of prison, even though you are technically a citizen, you don't have access to the ostensible spoils of democratic citizenship. That means that you still can't get a job. Negroes couldn't get jobs before they went to prison. In many states, they are attempting to prevent us from voting if you have a felony conviction. We just had a huge victory in Florida. We can't underestimate the value of that victory on number 4, because that is a huge intervention into a logic that says that if you go to prison and you are a quote-unquote felon, then you do not deserve to have access to democratic rights. You do not deserve to vote. So if you can't get certain kinds of public housing, you can't get certain kinds of education, you can't get a job, you can't vote, are you a citizen? That becomes the fundamental question. And the age of incarceration answers back, no. The age of incarceration is killing all of us. It's not just about the captive class. It's about the people who we hold captive. Think about Alice Walker's magisterial text, Color Purple. Not the movie, y'all, the book. That scene where Celie turned her cell phone off. Put it on vibrate at least. And after Celie did that, she stood over Mister and she put her hand up as he was beginning to curse her. And she said, the jail that you prepared for me is the one in which you will rot. Whoopi put a little more slang on it, but she said, the jail you prepare for me is the one in which you will rot. The collective jail that we have created in the United States, the jail that we have created through juvenile facilities, the jail that we have created in Guantanamo, the jail that we have created in Abu Ghraib, the jail that we have created in Gaza, the largest open-air prison in the world, is the one in which we will rot. Our lack of political imagination, our lack of growth, our lack of critical insight prevents all of us from being anywhere near as good as the democratic promises of this failed experiment known as America. But y'all still got the same lingering question. What that got to do with school? Our greatest educational theorists, and we could talk John Dewey. For me, next to Du Bois, maybe the towering intellectual of the 20th century, tells us to avoid the dualisms in society, to not think about school over here and society over there, but to understand the relationship and the interplay between school and society. You can't have society without having school. You can't have school without having society. School is a training ground and a preparation place for what? For society. School is a preparation pen for society, and society leaks into the school. We had an entire tradition of critical intellectuals in the 60s and 70s, the Bows and Gintises of the world, the Philip W. Jacksons of the world, who taught us about the interplay between school and society, but we got black folk who did it first and did it better. We got to talk about Muala Mushaja. Too much school and too little education. Helping us understand the relationship between the two fundamentally. We got to go back to the great Carter G. Woodson, who was speaking specifically to the Negro context, but understood more broadly that what school does for you, what school does for the Negro, doesn't just discipline the body for school, it disciplines the way that you navigate society, such that if you train a Negro's mind appropriately or inappropriately, if you educate her or miseducate her, you won't have to put them in their place. They'll put themselves in the place. You ain't got to tell them where to sit. They'll sit there on their own. You ain't got to tell them what door to go through. They'll go through it on their own, and if it ain't one, they'll build one. This is the tradition. So we're going to, at any moment, dismantle a world that is shot through with the logic of carcerality. If we're to ever tear down these prisons, we can't disconnect it from the world of school, because school hasn't been disconnected from the world of carcerality or these market impulses. Who's more neoliberal than school? Being privatized, charterized. Cut down at the legs. But they ain't just neoliberal, they also proto-fascist. Schools are locking up as many people as other social institutions, either directly or indirectly. So the question is, if school has the ability to shape the kind of citizens we become, if school has the ability to create mechanisms of change, mechanisms of possibility, then what role do you all have as educators? What role do you all have as educational leaders? What role do you all have as teachers? What role do we have as school security? What role do we have as grad students? What role do we have as educational researchers to work against the prison, to imagine a new possibility, to decriminalize the imagination? 1993, Mary O'Reilly wrote a wonderful little book called The Peaceable Classroom. She had been trained by an Egyptian postmodern literary critic, Ehab Hassan. They were struggling with the Vietnam War. And he posed a question to her in '67. How can we teach English so that people stop killing each other? She was haunted by that question. I remain haunted by that question at the level of school. And I keep asking myself, how can we do school in such a way that we stop caging each other? How can we do school so that we stop caging each other? It's that question that drives what I want to talk to you all about tonight, about decriminalizing the imagination. Mary O'Reilly asked the question, is it possible to teach English so that we stop killing each other? I don't even start with the kind of question of if. I don't start with the question of is it possible? I start with a much more audacious, almost Kantian question around what are the conditions necessary to constitute folk who can create a world without prisons? In other words, I ain't asking if, I'm talking how. I begin from a space of certainty. I begin from a tradition that says that we go out and we name it and we claim it. I ain't just talking Creflo, I'm talking Eshu Alegba. I'm saying that we have to affirmatively claim the vision and the social world that we want to create. And for me, that world is one without prison. And so, that audacious question comes with some demands. You talking about a world without prisons, you demanding something. I ain't say a world with smaller prisons. I didn't say a world with warmer and fuzzier prisons. I said a world without prisons. I'm talking abolition. To decriminalize the imagination is to begin from the premise that a world without prisons is possible. At the core, that has to be the freedom dream. Robin Kelly, the great historian, talks about the freedom dream. We have to begin with an end in mind, a telos in mind for what freedom will be. For some of us, freedom is the right to dominate. For some of us, the freedom is to be like white folk. For some of us, freedom is to simply reverse the relationship between oppressor and oppressed. I'm asking you all to be more audacious than that. I'm saying to begin with the most audacious and radical freedom dream that you can imagine. One that seems on its face impossible, but that has been proven throughout history, at least the history of African people in this strange land, that the impossible can happen. When Assata Shakur talks about her escape, she doesn't talk about it simply as an escape. Assata Shakur, in her magisterial tome herself, talks about the idea of being caged in a men's prison, in a basement, unable to escape. And when her daughter Kikuyu pushed against those bars, she saw that prison was a place not fit for her, and then she had a dream. The dream is where the audacity began, because the dream produced a possibility that the world said was impossible. She began with an idea that I'm going to escape from prison, a men's prison behind steel and concrete. She said it is possible, but it wasn't a fantastic dream. It wasn't a thin neoliberal Democratic Party dream for hope and change. It was something far more rigorous and far more dangerous and far more counterintuitive and far more work intensive. She said our dreams meant what they needed them to mean. After we had the dream, What made them actualized was the work. She dreamed of herself outside of prison, and then a group of freedom fighters did the work of releasing her, of liberating her, and one of them sat in her place for 3 decades, Sekou Odinga. That's a whole different tradition. It's a whole different level of sacrifice, but it's an audacious freedom dream. I'm saying, let's imagine a world without prisons. What does that mean in real life? What does abolition mean, and what does school have to do with it? Well, the idea of abolition is to believe in the existence of a world where the prison isn't our primary mechanism of punishment, where we don't resolve our social problems by caging folk, where justice doesn't equal punishment and punishment doesn't equal confinement. What does that mean in practical terms? Y'all like, yeah, that sounds good, but I know some Negroes that need to be in prison. I'm with you. I don't agree, but I know those very same Negroes. The first part of abolition is decarceration, literally getting folk out of prison. How do you decarcerate? You decarcerate through things like suspended sentences, through community dispute-based resolution, through community courts, time served, getting rid of cash bail. 80% of people in jail right now are in jail. Not prison, but 80% of people who are in jail right now because they simply don't have enough money for bail. 80% of people in jail are in jail because they don't have enough money not to be. That is evil. So decarceration. The other piece of it is excarceration. Eliminating the idea that the prison is the response to things that we don't like and to behaviors that we find problematic. You may not like prostitution. You may have an issue with prostitution. The question is, does it merit prison? You might not want folk to smoke crack. I'd rather none of you smoke crack. You can write that down. Do not smoke crack. But do I want to put you in prison for a medical problem? Because part of what happens through excarceration is that we create a narrative of a caged class and a certain kind of person who belongs in prison and a certain kind of person who does not belong in prison. Nobody walks around trying to lock up cocaine addicts. They came up locking up crack addicts because we created a social construction known as the what? The person who's addicted to crack, the person who would sell your VCR out the back of the house, the person you couldn't leave the doors locked for, one of your cousins, one of your aunties, one of your friends. What'd you call them? Crackhead. Don't act new on me, HU. You got degrees, you got fancy titles, you got nice new hair, you got new clothes, but y'all got some crackheads in the family. But the idea that there's shame and stigma around the idea of the crack addict is the problem because we don't call them addicted people, we call them crackheads. And the crackhead becomes not just a person making a bad choice, but somebody who's a fundamentally bad person. The lawyer on his desk snorting cocaine or the politician doing cocaine in the White House or whatever, hypothetically, is simply seen as somebody making a bad choice. But the person smoking crack on Georgia Avenue is a bad person. And where do you put bad people? Jail. So we normalize the idea that people who are engaged in behaviors that we don't like, that we might find antisocial, that we might find embarrassing, we decide that we want to erase or disappear them in this place called prison. Excarceration says, no, that's not how we resolve our social contradictions. And we got to get at the root causes. People don't just end up in jail. There's a correlation between folk who don't have access to Head Start and people who end up in jail. There's a correlation between folk who don't get early childhood education and folk who end up incarcerated. There's a connection between literacy rates in prison. Not the fourth grade thing, that's sort of an urban legend, but there is a correlation between literacy scores and mass incarceration. There is a correlation between people who get pushed out, to use Monique Morris's language, of school and who get pushed into prison. There is a connection between people who get invited or drawn into broken schools who end up in very highly functioning first-class prisons. We know what happens when you don't get a library. We know what happens when you don't get arts programs. We know what happens when the music programs get shut down. We know what happens when you don't have big brother, big sister. We know what happens when you don't get the coaching that you need. When those things fall apart, you end up with a greater chance of being incarcerated. We know what works. It becomes also a question of political will. To live in the age of incarceration is to get at the fundamental core issues that get us there. But that requires a different kind of disposition. And that's where the work of school comes in. The youth that come through your schools are part of, and I said I wasn't going to talk long, I'm just heating up, but we're going to get there. Stay with me, I promise. The youth that are in your schools, that are in our schools, are part of a war on youth. To decriminalize our imaginations, we must stop prosecuting a war on youth. A war on youth is a social process by which we replace the language of investment and love with that of containment and blame. We no longer look to youth as social resources, rather we look to youth as social burdens. How can we protect ourselves from them? How can we keep them away from us? That plays out in multiple ways. It plays out through the language of moral panic. These kids today is bad. These kids worse than what we had it. These kids are a whole different animal. You see it in your schools. I've been teaching here 30 years. I ain't never seen a kid this bad before. Every teacher I ever met say the same thing. Every year they met a kid they ain't never seen that bad before. At some point you think something will have to give. The language of moral panic around their cultural production. This music is bad. Their clothes are bad. Their hairstyles are bad. It plays out in the legal realm when we begin to criminalize the public spaces that youth occupy. Not only are they not allowed to hang around after school, they're also not allowed to hang out after 8 o'clock in many urban areas because we impose juvenile curfews. We criminalize public space. We impose anti-baggy pants legislation of all the things to impose. We prosecute them for victimless crimes. Remember, Michael Brown was not killed for stealing cigars out the store, although you should never be killed for stealing cigars out the store. He was initially stopped by Darren Wilson for what? Jaywalking. This is part of the war on youth. Monetizing their harassment. The war on youth is the draining out of social resources that I already discussed. This is all part of the war on youth. In order to get beyond an age of incarceration, in order to decriminalize our imagination, we must reinvest in youth, but we must also reinvest in those who train youth. We must reinvest in teachers. To end the age of incarceration, we must invest in the things that sustain students. Students are more likely to remain engaged in school if they have an active teacher, if they have what the culturally relevant folk call the warm demander, someone who is warm and loving and culturally centered, but also demands things from you within the fictive kinship model of African-centered education, where I am your other mama, I am your other auntie, I am your cousin, I am your big brother, I am that baba, and because I am that person, I will correct you in love. To end the war on youth, we must re-engage that model. But you can't do that if your only conception of accountability is a high-stakes test, which is shot through with the logic of neoliberal accountability. In other words, we're gonna measure how good this school is so that the school compete against other schools, so we can decide who's gonna get money, so that schools can fail, so that we can close down the school, so we can privatize the school, and so we can have another source of capital. And if teachers don't play ball, you lose your job. So you give a teacher no resources, no money, no direction, and then you wonder what happened when they start erasing them textbooks. like we saw in Atlanta. I'm not condoning cheating on the test, but the idea that we spent more attention and put more zeal into criminalizing and prosecuting teachers for test results than we have in prosecuting anyone who has stolen billions from everyday people through mortgage fraud, through loan fraud, through arms deals, is striking and telling about what we prioritize. We must end the war on youth, but let me move on, because once the youth get into the school, we must also consider the built environment of school. Schooling isn't just about the formal curriculum. Schooling is also about the rituals and practices. And the rituals and practices of school extend into the built environment. Imagine walking into a DC public school, or a Philadelphia public school, or a New York public school, or a Gut Bucket, Alabama public school. It's a line 20 minutes long to get in. You queued up in the line walking through. And as you walk through, it's taking so long because what? Metal detectors. Surveillance cameras. We have spent more money as a nation on surveillance equipment in schools than in prisons in the last 15 years. You got fingerprint scans, you got locker searches, you got body scans, you got parole officers, probation officers, real police officers. You got them all lined up. The infrastructure of school is such that it literally mirrors the kind of Foucaultian or Foucauldian panopticon that he talked about, where the prison was structured in such a way that you could surveil everybody. The prison and the school is structured in the same way. So you walking through school just trying to go to school, and you got your book bag, and you getting searched, and you getting checked, and you getting patted down, and you getting watched through the camera, and you got dogs sniffing through your legs, and then you finally get in after 20 minutes of trying to get through all that stuff, and once you get in, ain't nobody stopping you from leaving. There's a pedagogy of expectation. The built environment is doing pedagogical work. The built environment is doing intellectual and educational work. It's performing a kind of disciplining practice and process on our very bodies, so that you walk into school knowing the most important thing is for me to be searched and checked and prodded. But there's nobody to stop me from going through that exit door and walking out. It sends the message that what we prioritize is categorizing you and surveilling you, not investing in you. And so the built environment of school, from the technology of surveillance to the obsession with capitalist enticement. Remember back in the day, some of y'all old enough to remember Channel 1? You turn on that TV, you get 2 minutes of news and 15 minutes of ads. Then you walk into your lunchroom and you got the ads for teen magazines sprawled out across your lunchroom, and they're selling you Coke and Coca-Cola, to be clear. They're selling you Mountain Dew. They're selling you candy. They're selling you all these products, so that your very understanding of what it means to prepare for democratic citizenship is to be prepared through the lens of consumerism. What it means to grow up and be grown is to be able to buy stuff. We must shift to a new built environment. But it's not just about the built environment, it's also about the discipline itself. If you look at the DC public school handbooks in 1983, and then you jump up to 1993, and you jump up to 2003, and then you jump to 2013, you jump to today, it goes like this. Go to Philadelphia. One of my former students, Dakota Irby, did a dissertation on this wonderful topic where you look at the Philadelphia School Handbook, and it goes from 15 pages to 30 pages to 60 pages to 85 pages to 120 pages. And the reason the school handbooks keep getting bigger and bigger and thicker is because they keep finding more stuff that you can do wrong. To live in the age of incarceration is to live in a world where the discipline net gets wider. You can get in trouble for more stuff. Some of y'all used to bring Swiss Army knives to school. Some of y'all brought scissors to school. Some of y'all brought markers to school. And maybe you shouldn't have, but now you can get kicked out for that. And in the language and logic of zero tolerance, you will get kicked out of that for that. So the discipline net in school has gotten wider and wider and wider and wider and wider. But as Dakota Irby teaches us, the net doesn't just get wider, it also gets deeper. What does it mean for the net to get deeper? It means that not only can you get in trouble for more stuff, but the penalties get greater than ever before in school. That means some of y'all got detentions. How many of y'all got detentions in school? How many of y'all got suspended in school? How many of y'all got expelled from school? Okay, solid, no judgment, no judgment. But the logic of school discipline has shifted in fascinating fashion. Because now the net is deeper. So when you got those detentions and when you got those suspensions, who gave them to you? Your teacher? Okay, the dean, but the dean was just a teacher who didn't have to teach. Or was a vice principal who didn't get to do academic inquiry. But it was a school-based personnel member that was doing the work. Now the net gets deeper, so now you got not just school police, you got uniformed police officers. You got school resource officers, which are uniformed police, which enter the school, which turns the school from an educational space to a militarized space. That young girl that Eric Casebolt dragged out from Texas, that black girl who got dragged out of her desk, wasn't dragged out by an NTA or a school aide. She was dragged out by a uniformed police officer because the logic of school said that the net is wider, you get in trouble for more stuff. You got a cell phone and you talking in school, stuff didn't even exist when I was in school, but now it's deeper because a real police officer is going to lock you up. 5 years ago, a girl in Philadelphia got carried out in handcuffs. 6 years old. She had a temper tantrum. They locked her up for disorderly conduct. Now let's be clear. Nobody wants a temper tantrum. And if y'all got kids, when your kid have a temper tantrum, you might even have a radical imagination about what's possible for that child. You may have a T-loss that they couldn't even imagine for themselves of what you're going to do to that kid when they got that temper tantrum in the middle of the target. But it's developmentally appropriate behavior. And so what the widening net of criminality does is that it criminalizes developmentally appropriate behavior. If I got mad right now and started rolling around on the floor, you might look at me and say, yo, what's wrong with Mark? He bugging. But if you 6, perhaps I shouldn't be carried out in handcuffs. Perhaps there might be a developmentally appropriate intervention that is necessary. And quite frankly, me at almost 40, if I'm rolling around the floor, I would hope your first question would be, what's wrong with him? Not how can I punish him? But because we've widened the net of criminality in school, we have created school discipline policy that doesn't allow that kind of flexibility. And that lack of flexibility emerges really after Columbine. It emerges in a post-Columbine moment, which is fascinating that a white suburban Ohio school gets shot up and black folk in urban America and brown folk in urban America get criminalized and have to bear the brunt of white criminality. This is the point. But we don't want to name that. That would be like naming white people as domestic terrorists. Crazy talk. I'm sorry, no extra charge for that. To end the age of incarceration, to school against the prison, we must also change classroom discourse around school discipline. The great psychologist Russell Skibber teaches us about what? Disciplinary moments. Black people are overrepresented in suspensions and expulsions. It don't matter what percentage of the population we make up, we always are overrepresented on suspensions and expulsions. We are overrepresented on trips to the office. Remember you get sent to the office? She's like, yeah, I know. But what's interesting is not just that black folk get sent to the office more, it's that black folks' office visits, 80% of them are not from objective infractions, but rather subjective infractions, what Russell Skibber calls disciplinary moments. What does that mean? It means that, just give me one more little bit of information, white folk conversely are disproportionately sent to the office for what? Objective infractions. What that mean? It means you're supposed to be there at 2 and you got there 2:05. You late. an objective infraction. School handbook says don't smoke crack in class. You smoke crack in class. You probably should have some kind of intervention if you smoke crack in class. There's not a lot of debate about that. But the subjective interpretation, that disciplinary moment, is the moment in which an educator, who in urban America is still what? 70% white. And in a nation 90% white, has to make a subjective interpretation of your behavior and report that behavior into a context that may not find your behavior and your practices legible. In other words, the teacher decides whether you were being engaged or not, whether you were being respectful or not, whether you were being threatening or not, whether you were being violent or not. And if the teacher has to make that subjective interpretation, that's inherently problematic, but it's not inherently problematic across the board. Remember at the beginning I said that the idea of mass incarceration was dishonest because it implies that we're all being incarcerated at the same rate. Well, it's the same thing with the school discipline crisis. We're not all being disciplined at the same rate. Because when that teacher has to make a subjective interpretation of black student behavior, they are smuggling into the classroom a whole range of traditions and scripts about how to read black behavior. So when they say you talking too loud in class, what does that mean in the context of black folk? They kept talking over each other. Guess what? That's what we do. That polyvocality, that commitment to multiple voices happening at the same time is not just what we do in the barbershop and the beauty salon, as Yolanda Majors teaches us. It's not just what happens in all aspects of life, as Malefi Asante is teaching us. It's also in the drum. It's also in the Timberland beat. It's also in what the postmodernists will call a pastiche. But before postmodernists were talking about pastiche, African folk were talking about piecing together dead styles and resurrecting dead styles. And so you might have a sound over here and a sound over there. You might have an 808 over here and an old soul sample over there. It's part of our cultural ethos. I spend a lot of time in hair salons. I got a 14-year-old daughter. Spent a whole lot of time in barbershops. I'm going to milk this hairline until it's over. Got about 2 more years. Nobody takes turns talking. You know, Peanut, after you're done talking about LeBron James, I'd like to rejoin. No, we talk over each other. That's part of a cultural practice. But if you think that I'm disengaged because I'm talking over Billy, no, Billy needs to know that when Billy talking, I'm going to be talking too. And we're going to engage each other's interlocutors in a polyvocal context. And just because you don't do that, don't mean that it's wrong. Just because white folk don't do it, don't mean that it's improper. We got to engage in a different tradition. Now, we have to make some adjustments. I can't show up to my job 15 minutes late every day. I can't come to class 20 minutes late every day. Like, well, I operate from a social time perspective. I tried that for a little bit. It ain't work. However, if we live in a world that reads black bodies as inherently violent, read the DOJ transcript when Mike Brown was killed. Darren Wilson said, not he, but it. He said it was like he could walk through bullets. He couldn't see his humanity. He could only see the threat. Significant Fordham talks about those loud black girls. But those loud black girls got wisdom for the world. Those loud black girls become Fannie Lou Hamers and Ella Bakers and Angela Davises and Assata Shakurs and Harriet Tubmans and Marimba Anis. But black culture and black bodies aren't legible to them. So instead of saying, you know what, you loud but you right, or you loud but you wrong but you engaged, I'm going to engage you to help you get to the place where you can be right, I'm going to send you to the office. I'm going to dispose of you. I'm going to throw you away. The age of incarceration is about disposability. So when we have someone in our classroom whose behavior we don't like, we suspend them. That's the easy way out. You cut school and they suspend you. I'm gonna let y'all teach them a little secret. If you suspending kids that cut school, just want you to think about that for a minute. This kid don't like coming to school so much that he cut. And your punishment for him is that he ain't gotta come to school. Right, with your permission. I ain't no expert. But the idea of casting people out of society is a school practice that gets reinforced into society such that when someone does something outside of school that we don't like, the drug addict, the person who does harm, we think of them as disposable as well. And so we mirror the disposability of outside of school inside of school. If we want to reimagine this thing, we have to understand that teachers shouldn't be just the arbiters and dispensers of punishment, but they have to be facilitators of conversation. And we have to understand that individual acts of harm are not restricted to interpersonal one-on-one relationships, but that they affect entire communities. And so when things happen in the classroom that are problematic, we have to circle up the class. And teachers have to be facilitators of classroom circles that allow us to dialogue and build and talk about the harm that was done. Part of what it means to do a restorative model. Pause. Let me say that again. This is super important, and I apologize for not saying it sooner. Any idea of prison abolition hinges upon restorative justice. It hinges upon restorative justice. What is restorative justice? It is the alternative to retributive justice. Instead of thinking about punishment, we have to ask different questions. Retributive justice says, who was harmed? I'm sorry. Retributive justice says, who did it? And how can we punish them? Restorative justice asks, who was harmed? And how can we make them whole? Shifting the logic from punishment to wholeness is the key. Shifting from crime to harm is key. Because it also allows us to move into abolitionist mode, remember? Because if you're in a corner smoking crack, you're not doing harm to me. You stealing my TV, you are doing harm to me. But putting you in a cage isn't going to get me a new TV. So the question is, how can we restore in such a way that people are made whole again? So in classrooms, our restorative circles are one where we say something was done in the classroom community that did harm. How can we undo that harm? Not undo that harm, but redress that harm. We can't roll back history. But as my brother Kofi said, we can, like the Sankofa, look back. It is never taboo to go back and fetch that which has been left behind. So we must go back and look to history. We must go back and look to previous acts. We must go back and look to human interaction and ask the question, how can I make you whole again? Not by throwing you away, but by keeping you inside. I'm going to leave you alone in a second. Just let me say one more. Can I say one more thing? I'm sorry. I see you got the Sandman pose. That's all I'm making. Yeah, a little too close, man. I'm still nervous, man. I love y'all, Howard. I really do. I do. I'll wrap it up. I had a whole other thing about classroom literacy, but because one of the questions is, what do you do how can we teach against the prison? We discipline against the prison, and we build against the prison, we can dream against the prison, we can legislate against the prison. But what do we do in our classrooms? What do classrooms look like? What does this look like in real life when you leave Howard tonight and you go back in that classroom and close that door? What can we teach? As someone I've taught high school English and high school Spanish, and in both contexts, one of the things that I found we needed to do was use the classroom as a space that was a living laboratory of anti-prison work. We can teach confinement literature. And we can teach literature that we already teach as confinement literature. Some of y'all go to Sunday school every week, or did when y'all was kids. You ever think about reading John on the island of Patmos? As confinement literature? Some of you read social theory. Think about Antonio Gramsci, the prison notebooks. What does it mean for that? What does the prison context do for that? What does it mean to read Miguel Cervantes? Or to read Naguib in Egypt? As confinement literature. Letter from a Birmingham jail isn't just a political letter, it's a prison letter. How can we engage our students in classrooms by giving them actionable or real-life texts that talk about captivity and what it means to be a political prisoner? Side note, I say that all people incarcerated in the United States are political prisoners. But when we're talking about specifically the writing of folk like Mumia Abu-Jamal, my dear friend and brother, Martin King writing from a Birmingham jail. Soledad, brother by the great George Jackson, excuse me. Jonathan was his brother. James Baldwin's beautiful letter to Angela Davis, where he tells her, those of us who know the truth and do nothing or worse than the murder is hide in our names. For if we know the truth, we must regard your body as if it were our own, which it is, and render impassable the corridor to the gas chamber. For if they take you in the morning, they will come for us that night. What does it mean to read that as prison literature? What does it mean to go to 1994, one of the great artistic productions of the 20th century, Illmatic? What up, kid? I know shit is rough doing your bid. When the cops came, you should have slid to my crib. But fuck it, black. Ain't no time for looking back. It's done. Plus, congratulations. I heard you got a son. I heard he looked like you. Why don't your lady write you? Talking about loss. Militarization of police. Family, death. Despair, despondency. There's a way to engage these texts in our classrooms. Not just as abstract exercises, but to wrestle with what it means to be captive in American cages. We also got a whole bunch of kids whose dads and moms in prison. We writing abstract letters. Y'all still doing pen pals. Forget the pen pal. Write your mama and your daddy. And instead of making prison a site of shame, so we're embarrassed to have our mamas and daddies in prison, let's acknowledge the fact that maybe 1 in 60, 1 in 70 of ours are. The classroom has to be a space where we acknowledge the prison, where we fight against the prison, and where we build the prison into something different, a whole new political and social and physical imaginary. In other words, we can dismantle the prison from inside of school. But that requires one more thing, and then I'm going to leave you alone. We need a radical sense of hope. We need a radical sense of hope. Yesterday, (2018) midterm elections, there was a moment of hope in Florida. Then your hopes get dashed in the gubernatorial race. There's a moment of hope in Georgia. Then you get sad. There's a spark of possibility in Texas. Then you realize Texas is Texas. But underneath all that is possibility. My hope doesn't rest in politics. My hope doesn't rest in electoral machines or ballots. My hope rests in the people. And I have never been more certain, I've never been more confident that right here, right now, at this junction in history, that we will be victorious. And we will be victorious because we have everything we need in this room right now. The schools that we want, the communities that we desire, the relationships that we covet, we can build if we begin and simply dare to dream outside of the prison. If we dream outside of its logic and its rituals and its culture, if we decide to radically reimagine the world, it can be anything we want it to be. But we have to make sure that when we remake this world, it is in the image and likeness of our highest ideals, not in the image and likeness of white supremacy, not in the image and likeness of homophobia, not in the image and likeness of transphobia, not in the image and likeness of capitalism, but that is in the image and likeness of our best selves. And when we are our best selves, then we will live and dream and fight and build against the prison. Thank you, Howard. God bless you. Free all political prisoners. Thank you so much. I think we have time for questions and answers. A little bit.
I do want to recognize that the word inspiration kind of leave me with I do want to start before we get to questions that leaves me with a sense of inspiration, not just by the words that have been shared tonight, but also by the level of engagement by all the wonderful beings that are here, also thinking about their sense of inspiration to change the system and be better educators given the words of wisdom. And it made me think about my daughter who is in 4th grade who wants to be an educator. And I think that is a beautiful blessing to hear her say she wants to be a teacher. And your words inspire me to even empower her to do that. So thank you, thank you. At this point, we'll start on the right. Sekou.
Hi, good evening. My name is Natalie Munoz. I'm a first-year PhD program at the School of Social Work.
Oh, nice.
And I recently volunteered at a middle school here in DC. And when I was speaking with one of the kids, he said that the school is really strict and that if kids come without a belt, that they send the kids back home. And so I was just wondering, like, it really kind of touched me when you talked about this sense of discipline and how it's been exacerbated and it's mostly affecting Black and Latino kids. So what do you think could be like the next step in terms of how do we like change these school systems to stop penalizing kids that look like us?
Well, I think part of it comes with us having to articulate very clearly to ourselves what we desire. A lot of us are proud to say, my kid go to special school, they wear a uniform, they tough on discipline. We have to reimagine what discipline looks like and what educational achievement looks like. When I look at some of these independent schools and I see the kids, they don't have any uniform, no dress code. Some of them are like, they let you wear that to school? It's like, it's not even a thing. Because that's just not where the focus is. Now, I understand the logic and the reasons behind wanting to instill a particular type of order and discipline for our kids, but what it often ends up doing is creating a kind of stratification of not just labor, but also of ritual and practice. So that working class schools have to come in early, leave, they get worksheets, they don't get a lot of original thought, they don't get a lot of time to think to themselves, they gotta wear the same thing every day, and it prepares you for a working class job. Right, this is what Bowers and Gintis were talking about in their schooling in capitalist America back in '77. This is what Bourdieu was talking about in Pastor Jerome talking about '77 with reproduction in education, society, and culture. This idea that school, or that Paul Willis was talking about, learning labor, actually also in '77, it was a hell of a year. They were talking about the way in which school enables social reproduction. And that's not just in what you read, it's also in this kind of stuff. So part of what we have to do is say, in what ways would we be liberated by having to not wear this uniform? and not have this belt? And what does a zero tolerance policy on belts really do as an educational goal or an ideal? We have to ask those questions. Now, there are other ways that uniforms can improve. For example, just think of Imhotep Charter School or Sankofa Charter School in Philadelphia, where they wear traditionally African clothing every day. And that's done for a very particular cultural and pedagogical purpose. That's different. But what also is different is if you can't wash yours or you lose a belt, you don't get sent home, the community chips in, or they find you one. Right? We have to turn towards each other, not on each other. But again, but I'm going to answer your question a little more directly, because I still feels very abstract. I'm saying that we need community-based control of our schools. And we need to come together with what our school discipline policy should be, what our outcomes should be. Because if a neighborhood full of people said, yo, I want my kid to stay in school even if he ain't got no belt, I guarantee you he would stay in school without no belt. But the problem is we have to value that in a certain kind of way, and that means we have to reflect critically on what our educational goals are. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. So, excuse me, sir. My name is Barry Edwards, by the way. Hello, everybody. How y'all doing? What books would you recommend? Like, what books that made you come up to your conclusions? And yeah.
Oh man, that's.
I know, right? It's a loaded question, but.
That's just a hard question. On this particular topic.
In general.
Yeah, no, all right. So.
I'm a reader, so.
No, but that's me too. That's the problem. So, let me give you something for this topic.
Okay.
Just so. So the first thing I would do is start with sort of foundational texts on school and society and education. For me, you got to read Carter G. Woodson. You have to read Du Bois's work on education. You have to read the sort of autobiographies of self-attainment and growth and literacy, everything from Olaudah Equiano's narrative Gustavus Vasa, or Olaudah Equiano or Gustavus Vasa written by himself. You have to read Frederick Douglass. You have to start in that kind of rooted thing. I think you can't talk about any intellectual life in America without reading Du Bois and taking Du Bois very seriously. And we often start with 1903, Souls of Black Folk, because that's the popular text. And it's a rigorous and important text, but you can't just read Souls of Black Folk. You got to start 1896, suppression of the African slave trade. Go to 1899, as Professor Thompson talked about. 1899, yeah, 1899, the Philadelphia Negro. Then I want you can read some others, there's a whole bunch of stuff to read, but jump to 1935. Black Reconstruction. I think maybe the most important text of the 20th century, written by anybody, any social science. So you gotta take Du Bois seriously. But there's no intellectual life in America without the intellectual work of Black women. So whether it's Mariah Stewart, whether it's, oh my God, there's so many that, again, the work of Angela Y. Davis, the work of Bell Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins. We have to take it all seriously and engage all of it, right? On this particular topic, although I think all that stuff gets you here, Angela Y. Davis's work, Are Prisons Obsolete? One of the most important works. Anti-Prison Collective in 1978 came out with a book called Instead of Prisons. It's free, you can actually get it online. Just Google Instead of Prisons PDF. And it helps you think through abolition in a different way. If you think about prison abolition, Mumia Abu-Jamal and I wrote a book together. It's called The Classroom in the Cell, chapter 8, excuse me, chapter 6 and chapter 8 deal with this question of abolition and the relationship of abolition to school. Read Monique Morris's Push Out. Read Dakota J. Irby's dissertation on school discipline. Read all the work by African psychologists, particularly the ones who came through Howard. Dr. Boykins' work, I mean, it's indispensable. Gerald Jackson. You gotta read all of it. Yes and no. I mean, I'm just thinking.
Go on, sure.
Yeah, but I'm trying to give you very specific stuff for this. Read Maxine Green's work, Releasing the Imagination, which is sort of what I'm playing on here in the signifying tradition, with decriminalizing the imagination. Read The Peaceable Classroom by Mary O'Reilly. Start there, and then let's email and we'll talk about some more stuff, okay?
All right, sounds like a plan. What's your email, by the way?
I'll give it to you when I get off the stage. Yes, sir.
Hi, peace, y'all. This is Dr. Purchase. She has a question.
Hello everyone, I'm an alum 50 years ago almost. And it's a practical experience because I taught in DCPS, I taught at Howard, and so the connectivity is there. I want to know how you will empower all these beautiful young, soon-to-be alums of my alma mater to be mentors, because there's my mentor right there. Stand up. I taught her 30 years ago in DCPS. And she teaches at the preschool. But she mentors me and I mentor her. Because I got the email to come here, but guess what? You get a little older and don't remember to check your calendar. I got an email from her this morning saying I need to be here.
Oh, wow.
So I want to know, apart from incarceration and stuff, when the kids escape incarceration and they're miseducated still, like Carter G. Woodson would say, and I was taught by the Mass, C.L.R. James, all the greats.
Oh, yes.
And the incarceration is right here at Howard University, and I won't say exactly where, but I don't have a job to lose because I taught you and I'm retired. So I can say what I want to say. But the incarceration also occurs when they leave school and they don't have anybody to mentor them. Like she mentors me and I mentor her. So both of us could be hanging in a balance near to the jail cell, but we kind of keep each other together. How do you empower all these young people to get how do you encourage other people to mentor them and them to mentor the elders? So it becomes the Sanko for mentoring. Womentoring, sorry. Womentoring.
I like that, womentoring.
Yeah.
I think in many ways, and thank you so much for your service, and thank you for being our beloved elder. I'm grateful for your contribution, and I think in so many ways what you said is the answer. We have to commit, first of all, to mentor. We have to understand that that's a necessary thing. We have to, as the old proverb says, lift as we climb, right? We can't just climb and shut the door behind us. We got to leave room for other people and create space for other people and hold each other up. And I think that has to be a concerted effort, and I like to model mentoring from early on. So when you teach middle school, having 8th graders go back to middle school and mentor 5th graders. When people are struggling readers or developing readers in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade, doing reading mentorships with kids who are older, even just high school, is helpful. It not only helps foster greater learning, but it also creates, it begins a tradition and a lifelong pattern of helping people. As you grow, you're helping people, taking people with you. So creating mentoring programs in schools and mentoring models for educational intervention is important. As we do mainstreaming in classrooms, where you have the kids who are in different levels all in one room, which, there's some debate about that, but if you're in a mainstream classroom, one of the things that we should be doing is having more peer mentoring. Then when you get outside of the practice of direct teaching and learning, but more bigger life stuff, I think we need mentoring. I think we need mentoring programs. I think every one of us in this room needs to commit to mentoring. My cap is 5. I try to stay at 3 because I think mentoring is a very deep and important thing that you can't do with 100 people. You can help 100 people, and you can answer 100 emails, and I answer 1,000 questions. You can recommend some books to people and those kinds of things. But the kind of developmental model of mentoring, I think we have to do something that's functional, so we're not spread too thin. But I think we all in this room have to commit to mentoring somebody under us. But as you pointed out, and I think this is so important, Mother, and that is that we must also be willing to be mentored. Even if we think we've mastered something. I would be foolish not to call my elders to learn how to navigate a situation, to understand intellectual tradition, to get my work examined and criticized and all marked up, just like when I was in graduate school. I still want somebody to mark up my work and tell me I need to do this. And so that kind of a model is important, but I can't emphasize it enough. I always tell the Black Greek letter organizations that it's important. They all have mentoring programs and youth education programs, but that we have to take those programs as seriously as we do the other parts of that life. Same thing in churches, same thing in masjids, same things in synagogues. We have to have as part of our model those kinds of educational programs. Absolutely.
Hello. Okay, so I've been doing a debate with people back and forth.
It's a little hard. Is the mic on?
Okay, that's
Yeah, now we got you, sister.
Okay, so I've been doing a debate with people about, so you said people need to acknowledge the fact that their fathers or mothers are in prison and write to them. So I was talking with somebody and they was like, I told them that statistics plays a role in the sense of a young adult, because I feel like people say that if your father are in jail, you're most likely to end up in jail. So I've been going back and forth with people, like a lot of people didn't know. My father was in jail most of my life, and my grandfather just got out of jail for 26 years, and they would never know that because I don't acknowledge the fact. But they tell me that that you're going to get this because this person is in jail or you grew up in this way. But I don't feel like that's right. And like sometimes I don't like, what would you say about acknowledging the fact that?
It's a good question. We don't have to be prisoners. Howard Thurman said, don't reduce your dream to the level of that which is your immediate experience. Right? So we don't have to be prisoner of an event, he would say. He was talking specifically about Jesus, but he would say that that story is a reminder that we don't have to be prisoner of any event. That no matter what happens, it doesn't have to be the final story in our life. On the one hand, you have that will to transcend statistical predictions, etc. But we also, as thinkers and researchers and social scientists, etc., have to also take seriously these statistics, not to be prisoner to them, but to understand the nature of the threat. Right? So, for example, if I told you that drinking this bottle of water will give you a 40% chance of getting really, really sick, you would want to know that, and that would inform your decision whether or not to drink this water. Now, if you got thirsty enough, you may not have a choice. But you would want to know that before you drank it, right? And even if you get really, really sick, doesn't mean you can't get really, really well. You don't have to be prisoner to the moment, but you at least want to know what's at stake. And so when we understand that there is a commitment by the state, there's a structural commitment to mass incarcerating black people, to mass incarcerating the vulnerable, that's something you want to know. I want to know that if I don't finish high school, my chances of being arrested and incarcerated are this. I want to know that if I'm a struggling reader by 12th grade, my chances of getting pushed out of school are this. Not because I can't transcend it, but because that's what's at stake. At the same time, our job is to intervene into those systems, intervene into those crises, so that people don't have to be locked into that circumstance. So that if your father or mother is incarcerated or formerly incarcerated, you don't have to suffer the similar fate. And if we can intervene in that way, then we don't have to choose between acknowledging our truth, right, and trying to escape social misery. We can do both. Yeah.
Any more questions? And then we're wrapping up.
Question over here.
Okay, so raise your hand if you're in line right now with a question, so I can see who's there. It's 2 and 2. All right, so I'm going to take your 2 at the same time, and I'm going to take your 2 at the same time. All right, go ahead.
Hello. Okay. So I'm a psychology major, criminal justice minor, and the research that I want to do is kind of, with prison abolition, like what you were talking about. But the question that I've been grappling with is how do you frame restorative justice with the more heinous crimes?
Yeah.
So like things with children, things with
Serial killers, somebody blows up a synagogue, somebody kills.
Those are like the outliers of society. How do you frame
It's a great question, and I should have addressed that. I apologize for not addressing that sooner. Okay, I got your question. I want to take this one too.
Oh, and can you sign my book?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, how are you? My question was kind of also based more on solutions. I think personally, like the educational system hasn't really strayed from its vocational roots, and that like you even mentioned it a little bit with like standing next to each other, facing the walls and stuff like that, those specific aspects of it. So like, how is there a way to alter the education system without actually tearing it down completely?
No. Yes. Can you alter it? Sure.
Yeah.
But it doesn't need to be altered. It needs to be torn down. I'm an abolitionist. I don't want to tinker with school. I don't want warmer and fuzzier prisons. I want to get rid of them. I don't want to try and repair broken schools. I want to acknowledge that these schools are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and that they're not in the service of our people. I want to tear it down. In the radical tradition, I want to start from the root and dismantle it. And that's how I enter my abolitionist vision, which to your question, I think is a great one, right? Like this all sounds good when we're talking about somebody smoking crack. This sounds good, somebody stealing TVs. But what do you do with the serial killer, the rapist, the mass killer? I think that's a great question. don't think that the question of abolition has to hinge on me answering it well, but I will do my best to answer it well. I would begin by saying, as you acknowledge, those are outliers. So if by some stretch I conceded that those people need to be in prison, and I don't, but if I were to concede that those people needed to be in prison, the prison population would shrink from like 2.3 million to like maybe like 100,000, 200,000, which for me would be a hell of an abolitionist vision, right? My belief is not that there aren't people who do harm. There are. The question is, how do we redress that harm, and is the prison the best way to do it? Are there people who, because of a particular type of harm they've done, need to be outside of society? Yes, at times. If you are a rapist, if you are a serial killer, I think you need time away from society. You need to be outside of society. That's not in dispute. And I think sometimes the anti-abolitionist crowd will almost turn that into a straw man. Like, you want to put Dylann Roof back and, give him a slap on the wrist and bring him. No. Dylann Roof went to a church and killed 12 people. It's also hard, or more than 12 people, right? But it's hard for me to imagine anyone going in a church and killing that many people and not having a mental health issue. It's hard for me not to understand child abuse, child molestation, rape, as part of not just a kind of set of social machinery that normalizes rape culture, but also as a mental health issue. So I support secure mental health confinement under certain circumstances. The man who shot Ronald Reagan in the 80s, shot Ronald Reagan, did not kill Ronald Reagan, and he spent decades in a mental hospital where he got treatment and care and investment and love, and he came home 3 years ago. And he's no longer considered a danger to society. That, to me, is a success story. Now, some of you would say, yeah, but Ronald Reagan survived. What if Ronald Reagan had been killed? I mean, I think that's an important distinction to make, but I'm not sure it's a distinction with a difference. There are some forms of harm you can never undo. It's part of what it means to be human and to live in the kind of penultimate world we live in, right? I can't turn back time. But we can address harm. We can try and restore people, and we can try and repair people who have done harm as well. And so for me, if somebody pulls out a machine gun and kills 30 people, they need to be out of society. But the question is where? And some of you would say, well, yeah, if you put somebody in a confined facility for 20 years, that is prison. I would disagree with you. The structure of prison, the logic of prison, the medical engagement, the educational engagement is vastly different in what I'm proposing than what's in prison. But again, even if I'm wrong, and I'm not, but even if I'm wrong, you're still talking about a very small number of people, and so for me, that would still be abolition. Prison abolition isn't just about the end, it's also about the process. As our elders teach us, the victories in the struggle. And so for me, if abolition is the goal, even if we don't ultimately get there, we're still up. Because we get rid of bail, we get rid of privatized prisons, we get more pretrial detention. So abolition is both an end goal and a measuring stick for whether we're engaged in the right types of processes. Yeah. So we got these two over here.
Real quickly, I appreciate you coming out even though you're a little under the weather.
No, thank you, brother.
Big fan of yours since 07 when you gave Bill O'Reilly fits on Fox News. The brother over here with the black sweater, I just want to suggest one more book that...
Can you do that for him when we get done, just because people are waiting for us to wrap up?
Oh, yeah, no problem.
Yeah, thank you, brother.
I just want to tell him, new Jim Crow by Michelle.
So you're going to do it anyway, okay.
You suggested a book, Monique Moore's Pushed Out. My question directly correlates to that book because I'm almost finished with it. I used to coach for many years and tutor for years, and I noticed that book directly talks about there's been a huge shift from boys being disciplined in school to girls. Now I just want to know your opinion as far as why do you think that is, where more girls are being like suspended, put in, time out or whatever, expelled. Why do you think that is?
As a social scientist, I hate guessing, and I just don't know the answer. I could surmise a few guesses, and some of it has to do just be with the dwindling number of boys in certain kinds of spaces. And also the kind of adultification of children, particularly black children over the last 2 decades, which has always happened, but we see it increasingly in school discipline policy. But the answer to why, I can honestly say I don't know. It's outside of my area of expertise, and I try not to do that in academic settings. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Precious. I'm a freshman. And so the thing that I've been dealing with as a newfound college student is the cognitive dissonance of being available to all this knowledge and the invigoration of it, and being able to understand how I would bring that back to my community and bring that back to my family. So the question that I have is, how do we lead the process of examining scholarship in small talk or absence of jargon or spaces just like this at the collegiate level? How do we bring that into talking to our families on a plain level, and how do we steer away from educational elitism?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's always the last question, harder. Thank you for that wonderful, wonderful question. This is what Howard produces. Howard freshman asking that question. I love y'all so much. I think one, we have to kind of disabuse ourselves of the idea that just because something is smart and complicated, that it can't be understood by everyday people. My experience is that oftentimes when things are shrouded and dipped in so much jargon and language, there's no correlation between the jargon and the complexity of the idea, right? And oftentimes people who lean on the jargon too much often don't understand the idea all that well themselves. I told Jesse Jackson one day something, and I was like, oh, it's a complicated idea. And he was like, if I can't understand it, and my grandmama can't understand it, that's a failure of your education, not mine. And he was right. So part of it is we have to begin from that place, right? That we don't need, let me be very clear, I do think there are moments where as theorists, we need a new language. We need a language of possibility, and that we need new words and new ideas in order to grapple with new concepts. We need to create new analytical rooms. I'm not saying we never need new stuff, but that stuff can be explained in ways that people can understand, in ways that people who don't have the blessing of our education or experience can access it. I think that's super important. And I think part of what we have to do as scholars, I'm going to talk to the scholars first, is we have to write our work to other scholars, to be sure, but that work can be translated into other venues. We can write executive summaries of our work. We can write memos of our work. We can make accessible versions of our work. We can do education circles and teachings in our neighborhoods, in our communities, where we explain the complexities of our work in ways that are accessible. We should begin to answer the first part of your question, which I think was super important as well. We have to begin from, as Dewey talked about, and how we think, the felt need. What do we need? What do our people want? If I'm in a neighborhood where I gotta go 4 or 5 miles for fresh fruit and vegetables, right? Food insecurity is something we need to be talking about. And yeah, I can come up with all kinds of urban geographic spatiality, scarcity conversation, and that's cool. But if I'm trying to get somebody to understand why the other side of town has tomatoes and community gardens and co-ops, and all I got is a liquor store right here, I have to begin with the felt need. And then I think from there, any problem solving we do, any inquiry we do, any research or investigation we do begins from that felt need. And so therefore we can't be educational elites if we're beginning from what people need and we're not what we think they need, or what we think they should need, or what we think they want. Because that's often the point, is we go to people and say, here's what the problem is, here's the problem with the world, here's what you need, here's what you need to do, here's what's going on, and if you listen to me, your world will be all right. And they're like, I don't need that. Or I don't need the way you think I do, I need this other thing. So let's start there. And even if you're on some analytic level right, if you don't begin from what people want from you, if you don't give people what they won't want what you have to give. So you have to start there. And I think we have to stop bowing down. This is my last remark. We have to stop sort of giving into this idea that wisdom only resides in these places. Because these places have done so much more harm than they have good. These universities are much more like an occupying force in neighborhoods than they are a resource for the few people who live in these places. So, if we don't fetishize university knowledge, we don't ascribe to it magical power, but instead we realize that there's genius with that deaconess in your church, that there's wisdom with that imam, that there's wisdom with that baba, that there's wisdom with your grandmom and them, and we harness that wisdom. And we don't have to measure its value in relation to whether it fits with some European theorist. Then we can begin to truly and deeply engage in educational conversations and dialogues that aren't rooted in elitism or social distance. Howard, I love y'all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Mark Lamont Hill, your words of wisdom, inspiration, represents, I think, invoke the spirit of Charles Thompson and what the goal is of this lecture and the history and your contributions. We have a tradition here in the School of Education of acknowledging that sphere of influence for racial justice, for social justice, and your efforts and your words and inspiration and the conversations and in your overall work. And we want to give you this wonderful gift from us. It's well wrapped in
I was like, y'all got me bubble wrap?
black bubble wrap.
Right, of course. Oh, it's cool. Yes. How are we personal school of education?
Thank you.
And I gotta say again how grateful I am that you all invited me here. And grateful for all of you for staying and really engaging me. It means so much. I wish you all so much love and peace and dignity and respect. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Hopefully we'll have some food left. We'll see you on November 6th, 2019. Hopefully we'll be back in Blackburn. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the committee. Thank you to everybody here. Our wonderful folks who came all the way from Nigeria, I believe. Thank you, NAPSE. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you.